Hello students, my name is Iqbal Singh Sandhu and I teach paper 2 of the political science optional. In this particular video here, we are going to have a discussion on certain few selected questions of paper 2 of the political science optional mains paper 2020. And before I start that discussion, before we start discussing the questions and its answers, I'd like to tell you that this year's paper was very good. Any student who had prepared thoroughly, had decent amount of conceptual clarity, also was aware of the recent developments, would have done very well. Question was the whole question paper, the paper this year was a mixed bag and a good mix of static and dynamic questions both. There were very good static questions which were more related with the concepts and theories given in the syllabus, and there were also a good amount of dynamic questions which were connected to the recent developments as far as international politics is concerned. So it was a decent paper, good paper. I'm sure who is well prepared, an aspirant who has done all the right things, can score very good marks in this year's paper. There were no unexpected questions. There were no arbitrary questions. There were no such questions which were out of the syllabus. All questions were strictly from the syllabus which have been prescribed by the UPSC, and therefore anybody who has good understanding of all the concepts and the theories and also quite well updated with the recent developments can do very well. So now let us start having discuss the nature of the paper which was asked this year. Now let us start discussing certain questions from paper 2 of the political science and international relations optional. So first of all, you all may be very well aware that as far as the paper is concerned, every year the whole paper is divided into two parts, section A and section B. Section A deals with the area of comparative politics, international relation theories, key concepts, and also international contemporary issues, major world issues, and international organizations. So these are the broad areas which are asked in the section A of the paper. Section B of the paper is devoted completely to India's foreign policy, India and the world, India's foreign policy, India's relations with countries all around the world, bilateral relations, also India's stature as a global power in world politics. So both these sections, section A and section B, will be discussed today in this particular video. As I mentioned earlier also, I will discuss. It's not possible for me to discuss all the 28 questions in this video because that will take a very long time. I have selected few questions. I have selected certain selected questions which we will do in this particular video. And according to me, I have selected a question from each area of the syllabus and also those questions which are qualitative in nature and which will also help you understand the nature of the paper and prepare you for future also those students who are watching this particular recording to appear next year. It will prepare those students to understand the nature of the paper, nature of the questions, and therefore attempt in the right manner in the days to come. So before I start discussing the question, I would like to also help you understand how to understand questions asked in the political science optional paper, how to approach these questions, and how to frame your answers. So you should be very careful while reading the question. You should always read the question twice. First reading of the question and then also a second reading of the question. You should always read it twice. And after identifying the keywords in the questions, keywords means which are the areas from which the question has been asked, particular area, particular issue, or a particular concept, or a particular theory. So identify that keyword and then also try to understand the context, in what context this question has been asked. If you get a question on realism, you identify the keyword realism, you can't just start writing everything you know on realism. That is not advisable at all, because there's a word limit, prescribed word limit also. You have to attempt that question on realism in the context which it has been asked. So if you understand the context in which it has been asked, then you know the requirement, then you know what to write, what not to write. And then as per the requirement of the question, you attempt it, you frame your answer, and always adhere to the word limit. If you don't adhere to the word limit, it is obviously very annoying for the examiner also, and therefore you would suffer in terms of your marks. And also secondly, if you don't adhere to the word limit, then you will not be able to complete your paper. There is a certain amount of, finite capacity of words which a human hand can write in the paper in the given 3 hours. And according to our experience, the amount of questions which you have to attempt in the paper and the word limit which is prescribed, you can only do as much as has been asked by UPSC. Now, if you start going beyond the word limit, if you start writing more than what is required, then at the end of the paper, you will end up leaving out questions. You will not be able to complete the paper. I have students, in my experience, I have seen my students spending a lot of time writing short notes. As you must be very well aware, there are 10 short notes asked, 5 in section A, 5 in section B, and they are compulsory to attempt. You don't have a choice. Whereas in other questions and other questions, 20 markers, 15 markers, you have got a choice. But in terms of short notes, every short note is 10 mark each. It is for 10 marks. They are compulsory. And I know students who spend a lot of time writing short notes, 2 hours writing short notes, and then the remaining time which they are left with, in those 2 hours, they have to complete in that remaining 1 hour, they expect themselves to complete the remaining 2/3 paper, which is not possible. So therefore, you have to divide your time very wisely. You have to understand the question very wisely. Not just understand the keyword, but also identify in what context the question has been asked, and hit the nail on the head. And from the first line itself, start writing what has been asked by the examiner. And that is how you will be able to write best answers, you will be able to complete the paper, and that is how you get good marks. And if you get good marks in your optional paper, it can certainly propel you up in that merit list and can help you fulfill your dream of becoming an IAS officer. So, having said all of this, I hope you have got the point what I wanted to tell you. Now, in this particular background, whatever I have said, how to understand the question, in the same manner, I would like to discuss the questions of this particular paper, and let us start with the short notes of section A. So, section A short notes, here I have decided to discuss part D and part E. So we will have a discussion on this question D and E. So first let us discuss 1D. The question says, critically examine the impact of process of globalization from the perspective of the countries of the global south. So obviously there are two key words here. One is globalization and then is global south. And I hope you understand both these. Globalization is one of the most important concepts mentioned in the syllabus as far as PSIR is concerned, and we have had extensive discussions on this particular concept, and I had also given you extensive notes in the classroom while teaching the paper. So here you have to discuss the concept of globalization, but you have to critically examine it. That means you have to point out what are the problems with globalization. You have to point out all those criticisms which have been done by experts as far as globalization is concerned. And yes, the context of the question is that you have to do it from the perspective of global south. Now, this is a short note. It is for 10 marks. Word limit is given, that is 150 words. UPSC has already prescribed the word limit. That is that you have to write the short notes in not more than 150 words. So you have just 150 words for yourself, and you have 10 marker short note here. So you cannot start writing an essay on critical evaluation of globalization. You can't do that. You have to write what has been asked, and what has been asked here, and that is criticism of globalization, critical examination of globalization, but only from the perspective of the global south. So global south is the third world, the developing countries of the world. So you have to bring out the criticism of globalization, which has been done from the scholars and experts of third world countries and even leaders of third world countries. So how would you go about here? So I would tell you that first 2-3 lines of your short note, you should try and briefly define globalization in a very crisp manner. So as you can start by saying that globalization is an ongoing process of international economic and technological integration made possible by advances in transportation and communication. The present model of globalization, economic globalization, is based on neoliberal economic policies. So this is your introduction, definition of globalization. Yes, it's an optional paper. You must try and write academically rich answers. So in all your answers, you must try and quote certain experts and scholars, which will definitely give you an edge over your other competitors. So while mentioning the definition, you can mention any of the experts which I have given to you in the notes. So many of them who've tried to define globalization. You can mention any one of them and quote them, and also write down how they understand globalization. For example, you can say Robert Gilpin. You can write down about Robert Gilpin. Robert Gilpin has defined globalization as integration of world economy. You can write this one line and mention the name of the scholar, or you can also, write down Marshall McLuhan. Marshall McLuhan has defined globalization as global village. He has compared the process of globalization with his idea of global village. So write down the definition, mention any one of these scholars. There is a long list. There are other scholars also. I'm sure you know. They're given in my notes, so you can pick up. But to me, these two are the most catchy scholars. They are the most important because the way they have defined globalization, that is how the world has accepted the process of globalization. Robert Gilpin says it's the integration of the world economy, and that is how we see globalization. Economic globalization is the most robust. Similarly, Marshall McLuhan says it's a global village. That means the whole world has got interconnected and all countries have come closer to each other. So that is also well accepted. So you can mention any one of these scholars. So once you have done this, once you have started with the defining globalization, then you straight away jump onto its critical evaluation from the perspective of global south. And yes, you can say that as far as developing countries are concerned, globalization has been criticized for creating inter- and intra-state inequalities. Scholars and experts from developing countries from global south has described globalization as unequal and uncivil. Third world countries have identified and have tried to bring out the dark side of globalization. And what is this dark side of globalization? It has adversely affected agriculture and food security in third world countries. It has led to environmental degradation in third world countries. It has also helped in the spread of radical terrorism, religious terrorism all around the world, and it has also assisted criminal activities like human trafficking. So this is the dark side of globalization, which has been highlighted by third world countries. And when you talk about the criticism of globalization from the perspective of third world countries, you must mention Marxist scholars in your answer, because Marxism, the Marxist perspective in IR, has criticized globalization robustly. According to Marxism, Globalization is nothing but the global expansion of capitalism. And Marxist scholars, especially belonging to the dependency school, have criticized globalization from the third world perspective. Scholars like Rosenberg says globalization is a self-serving myth, and globalization, he says, is nothing but an attempt to conceal Western capitalism and US hegemony. Similarly, there are scholars like Immanuel Wallerstein, who has given the world systems theory, and he is also of the opinion that the world is divided into three categories: core countries, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. Core are the most industrialized developed countries, semi-periphery are emerging economies, BRICS economies, periphery countries are the least developed, underdeveloped, developing countries of the world. And he says, Immanuel Wallerstein says, that due to globalization, with the help of globalization, which is based on neoliberal economic policies, a drain of wealth is happening from periphery to the core. So, globalization, according to Immanuel Wallerstein, is barbaric. It is actually leading to exploitation of the third world countries, and the only countries which have benefited from the south is the emerging economies, BRICS economies. That is why Immanuel Wallerstein also says that globalization is uncivil, uneven, and Western in nature. Arundhati Roy also has opined, she is also of the view that globalization is nothing but a mutant variety of colonialism. So she is also trying to highlight how through globalization the developed world is exploiting the developing world. Then Ramesh Thakur, Professor Ramesh Thakur, also is of the view that globalization has caused a development dichotomy. It has caused, and therefore it has not worked in the favor of developing countries. So these are all those scholars which majorly belong to the Marxist school of thought, and inside Marxism you can say dependency school, and they have criticized globalization from the perspective of the global south. So you should, while doing the critical examination, quote these scholars, quote Marxism. That will make your answer academically more richer, and that is what is required. Globalization questions are also asked in the GS paper. There is nothing new, so nothing grand about it, nothing unique about it. You write globalization answers in GS paper also, but this is an optional paper. How will you differentiate an optional answer from a GS answer? Or if you use the name of the scholars, if you use the name of the experts, if you quote theories of IR in your paper, then only your answer is different from a GS answer. That is what an optional answer is, academically rich answer. That is how you should attempt it. And in your concluding remarks, you must again quote scholars, and all these scholars, the names which I am mentioning, all of them have been given to you in the detailed typed notes which I had given to all my students. And there, in your concluding remarks, in the last couple of lines, you can say that yes, it has not benefited the developing world the way it was expected to. There was this theory that a trickle-down effect would happen, and the developing countries and the poorer people inside developing countries would also benefit from globalization and neoliberal economic policies, which unfortunately has not happened, and which doesn't mean that the globalization should be abandoned. There are scholars like Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz. Both of them are Nobel laureates in economics. Both of them have suggested that these developing countries should try and make globalization work. Amartya Sen says developing countries should develop infrastructure and strengthen their governance mechanisms to benefit from globalization. Joseph Stiglitz have suggested that in order to make globalization work, it should be made more democratic. The global institutions, international organizations which are responsible to take forward the idea of globalization, they should be made more representative. Democratic deficit in these organizations should be corrected. I'm talking about organizations like UN, IMF, World Bank, WTO. So this is how you can attempt this particular short note. Small definition, then straight away start criticizing it from the Marxist perspective, from the global south perspective, and then conclusion. All of this you have to fit in 150 words. It is a challenge, but you learn to do this if you do more and more of answer writing practice. Nothing else. There are so many other schools of thought which have criticized globalization. Other criticisms are also there. It's a short note. The context of the question is do it from the perspective of Global South. So you have to just restrict yourself to that and not go beyond that. Now we will discuss the next question. So 1E, 1D we have discussed. Now let us discuss 1E. This is again a short note. It's a 10 marker. 150 word limit is still there. What are the core assumptions of idealism as an approach to study of international relations? Explain its continuing relevance in peace building. Okay, so this is, I must say, a beautiful question. Very rarely, UPSC uses this terminology now. UPSC has not used this terminology of idealism in IR since many years. They rather use the terminology of liberalism in IR, whereas in the syllabus, when you look at the chapter of approaches on IR, idealism is mentioned there. So a lot of students, they did come back to me and they tried to confirm and inquire that what does this idealism here signify? So this is nothing, and I had explained this in much detail in my classes as well. When they say idealism, idealism is nothing but liberal school of thought in IR. Especially the initial proponents of liberal school of thought in IR during the interwar period were considered as idealist. And that is what you have to restrict yourself to, and that is what you have to explain here in this particular question. So you have to write down about idealism. What is idealism? What are its core assumptions? That means what are its major arguments, core arguments on the basis of which this school of thought has been developed. And obviously, you also have to write down about its contemporary relevance in the context of peace building. This is very important here. You have to stress in your answer the link between the arguments proposed by idealists in IR and how it can lead to peace in the world. So this is what you have to do in this particular question, and you start off by, your answer should start by explaining idealism, not more than 3 to 4 lines, or just a simple definition, and then you can go into its core assumptions. Explaining idealism, you should hit the nail on the head. You should let the examiner know, I understand what idealism is, what you are hinting at. So you should explain what is idealism here. So idealism is similar to, synonym with liberal institutionalism. And you should bring this up in your opening statement itself, that it is a synonym to liberal institutionalism in IR. This school of thought in IR was given by Woodrow Wilson, the former American president. After the end of the First World War, he had given his famous 14-point speech where he had given core features of a liberal world order. And according to Woodrow Wilson, if these features are followed in international politics, then he had suggested 14 points. According to him, if these 14 are followed, then we will have a peaceful world, we would have a prosperous world, and we would be able to avoid a second world war. Because it's just after the First World War when Woodrow Wilson had given that 14-point speech in which he had suggested those liberal principles. According to him, all countries all around the world should follow those liberal principles in order to create a peaceful and prosperous world and in order to avoid a second world war. And those ideas which he had suggested in his 14-point speech constituted this school of thought in IR, which is called liberal institutionalism. Liberal institutionalism was not able to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War, and therefore the realist scholars like E.H. Carr, British historian E.H. Carr, he had criticized Woodrow Wilson and his ideas. He had criticized Woodrow Wilson. He had said he is guilty. He had said that people who believe in liberal institutionalism, they are guilty of ignoring the realities of power politics in IR. And that is why we have not been able to prevent a second world war. In his criticism, it was E.H. Carr who had said that people who follow liberal institutionalism or people who follow the ideas of Woodrow Wilson are idealists or utopian. So it was the realist criticism. E.H. Carr had criticized ideas of Woodrow Wilson as idealist and utopian. So from that, this terminology has stuck with this idea with Woodrow Wilson, idealism. So the initial school of thought related to liberalism in IR was considered similar to idealism or utopianism, as said by realist critiques like E.H. Carr. So this is what you should know, and this is what should be highlighted in the introduction itself, that idealism is synonym to liberal institutionalism, which has been derived from the 14-point speech of Woodrow Wilson, where he had outlined the liberal features or liberal foundations of where he had outlined the features of a liberal world order. And these ideas were criticized by realist scholars like E.H. Carr. E.H. Carr had described these ideas as idealists or utopian. So that is how this should be, highlighted in your opening statement itself. The examiner would be so happy to read it that the student has crystal clear conceptual clarity. He knows what is idealism, from where this term has come in IR, and what do I mean? Because if you say idealism is equal to liberalism in IR, liberalism has 10 sub-traditions. Interdependence, complex interdependence, democratic peace thesis, and functionalism. These are all different. Republicanism, these are all different sub-traditions of liberalism. You need a word limit of 2000 words to describe liberalism in IR. You don't have to do that. You have to only stick to liberal institutionalism, the idea of liberal institutionalism, which was given by Woodrow Wilson after the end of the First World War, where he had suggested features of a liberal world order. And those are the core assumptions which we have to mention in the answer which has been asked. What are the core assumptions of liberal institutionalism? And liberalism per se, as given by Woodrow Wilson after the end of the First World War. First of all, liberalism believes and agrees with the idea that in international politics there is anarchy. Like the realists, they agree with the idea that in international politics, they do agree with the idea, the basic idea that it is anarchic. But according to them, this anarchy can be managed. According to liberal institutionalists, according to Woodrow Wilson, this anarchy can be managed. They say that like you have a state in domestic politics to maintain law and order, similarly, there should be an authority or an international institution which should be created at the global level to manage this anarchy. And if we have such an international organization, such an international institution, then this anarchy, the problem of anarchy can be resolved. It can be resolved. That is where Woodrow Wilson had suggested creation of an international organization, as a result of which, after end of First World War, League of Nations was created. So League of Nations as an international institution was created in order to help countries cooperate with each other so that they can resolve their conflicts peacefully rather than going to war with each other. And this, from here this word has come, institutionalism, liberal institutionalism. This is the core idea, that create institutions, create global institutions which will help countries cooperate with each other and resolve their conflicts peacefully. This is the first core assumption, and that there is a scope of cooperation, which brings me to the second assumption, and that assumption is realism says international politics is nothing but power struggle, and inevitably there will be conflict and there would be war. This idea, Woodrow Wilson disagree with this. Liberalism disagrees with this. Idealism disagrees with this. The liberal institutionalism disagrees with this. They say that cooperation in world politics is possible, because states, they do not believe in the idea of relative gains but absolute gains. Therefore, cooperation is possible. Conflict is not inevitable. That's a very grim picture which is painted. Cooperation is possible. They are motivated from the ideas of John Locke. John Locke had said that yes, man is self-interested, but at the same time, man has enough reason to accommodate the interests of the others. John Locke had given the idea of enlightened self-interest. So these people, idealists, liberal institutionalists, Woodrow Wilson, had the proponent, they were motivated from the ideas of people like John Locke, scholars like John Locke, whereas realists has been motivated from the ideas of the scholars like Thomas Hobbes. They give a very grim picture of human nature, and therefore conflict, they do suggest that society is inherently conflictual in nature, whereas liberals don't. So that is the second as core assumption, that yes, cooperation is possible if you create international institutions, and it is possible because states do not believe in the idea of relative gains but absolute gains. Then another core assumption of liberal institutionalism is the idea of collective security. The idea of collective security. Realism says states suffer from security dilemma. Therefore, they become as power maximizers, and they get into conflicts with each other, and therefore war is inevitable. This is the realist logic of IR, and this is what they call is they describe as power politics in IR. But liberals, idealists, they say no. If you have a international institution which guarantees collective security to all its members, then this can act as a solution, as an alternative to, as a solution to the problem of a security dilemma and uncertainty in IR. So if the idea of collective security is implemented, then it can act as a solution to the problem security dilemma and uncertainty in IR. And international institutions like League of Nations, and nowadays we have UN, should take the responsibility of implementing the idea of collective security. Then another core assumption of liberal institutionalism, or you can call it as idealism as mentioned in the question, or you can also say this was mentioned in the 14-point speech of Woodrow Wilson after First World War. Another core assumption is freedom of free trade, implementation of the idea of free trade and free market economy. This school of thought is of the view that if you implement free trade in world politics, if you implement the idea of free market economy in world politics, that would lead to a much more prosperous world, and therefore there would be lesser problems, there would be lesser complications, lesser conflicts. They also advocate that we should have freedom of navigation. And they also, liberal institutionalists, they also advocate that, by creating international institutions, there will be a beginning of more and more of treaties, agreements, which will eventually form a body of international law. So these international organizations will help develop international law and implement that international law, which will eventually solve the problem of anarchy, and there would be stability, law and order in international politics as well. So these are their core assumptions when it comes to liberal institutionalism. Create international institutions, cooperation is possible, idea of absolute gains rather than relative gains, then idea of collective security, free trade, and also international law, adherence to international law. So these are the core assumptions. According to Woodrow Wilson, if you do all this, then you will have a liberal world order which will be more, which will ensure peaceful and stable world, and we will be able to prevent a second world war. There are many statements, jargons which are used to describe ideas of liberal institutionalism. For example, they say, if you follow all of this, then you will be able to convert the jungle of international politics into a zoo. Jungle means anarchy. Zoo means managed anarchy. You found a solution to this. You have certain norms, rules to follow in a zoo as compared to the jungle. So they say, if you follow all this, then liberal institutionalists say you'll be able to convert jungle of international politics into a zoo of international politics. So these are the core assumptions of liberal institutionalism or idealism. You must bring out in your answer. It was given by Woodrow Wilson, and these ideas were criticized by E.H. Carr as idealism and utopian, and because they were not able, because League of Nations was not able to prevent the outbreak of the Second World War. And then you start writing the core assumptions, which I have just discussed with you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all core assumptions. And then there's a second part to the question also, that you have to bring out the continuing relevance of idealism in peace building. So when you look at it in contemporary times, League of Nations is not there anymore. League of Nations was disbanded when the Second World War broke out. So right now, which are those organizations which are taking these ideas of Woodrow Wilson forward, or which are trying to implement the main arguments of liberal institutionalism? Which are those organizations? UN is one of them, IMF is there, World Bank is there, WTO is there. So these bodies are there which are based on ideas of liberal institutionalism. These are international institutions, international organizations based on multilateralism, and their endeavor is to resolve global problems peacefully with the help of negotiations, with the help of diplomacy, resolve conflicts rather than going for physical wars. So these organizations are there, and they have been criticized for not being very successful, but in many ways they have also contributed a lot. You can mention in your answer that United Nations, through the United Nations Security Council, has tried to implement the concept of collective security, which they have not been able to do very well because of the misuse of veto power. So in order to play a role in resolving conflicts peacefully, UNSC has come out with the idea of UN peacekeeping operations, which are ongoing right now in the world. Even though they are not synonym to the idea of collective security, but they are ongoing, and they are playing a role in resolving many conflicts in the world peacefully. Then also resolution to protect, R2P, which tries to uphold the concept, which tries to protect human security and justice inside states, not in interstate conflicts, but also in intrastate conflicts in cases of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. So, R2P is also there. And then also organizations like UN, they have adapted themselves to the extent that they are also trying to help countries of the world combat terrorism. Because terrorism is a new security threat in the world, so there also they are playing a role by creating the 1267 Sanctions Committee, and therefore banning certain terrorist organizations. Similarly, this idea of peace building, which has been mentioned in the question, this can be traced back to the report of Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary General of UN, in his report called An Agenda for Peace, way back in early 90s, had suggested the idea of peace building. Peace building means where you do peacekeeping, but at the same time you also help the conflict zone rehabilitate, so that there is enduring peace, long-term peace. That is also being done. That is also an attempt is being made by UN to do that. So you can highlight all these points: contribution, continuing relevance. But yes, at the same time, much more is left to be done. There are at many fronts, there have been disappointments. United Nations Security Council have not been able to implement the idea of collective security in its true sense because of misuse of veto power. That is why it needs reforms, it needs changes. Similarly, when it comes to the international economy, these institutions, IMF, World Bank, WTO, when it comes to the monetary policy, when it comes to funding development, when it comes to free trade, these international institutions are also helping countries cooperate with each other and coordinate their policies. So, You can mention all this in that second part of the short note where it says bring out or highlight the continuing relevance of this idea in peace building. So that is how you can attempt this particular question. Half your job will be done as far as examiner is concerned if in the first paragraph you are able to bring out the connection between idealism and liberal institutionalism and Woodrow Wilson, and how E.H. Carr had criticized Woodrow Wilson as idealist or utopian. If you are able to do this in your first paragraph, the examiner already will be satisfied with you that you have the right amount of conceptual clarity and you know exactly what has been asked. Okay, so that is how you should start the question, and then write down the obviously the core assumptions of liberal institutionalism, and then end with the continuing relevance part as well. So now doing this, I discussed this precisely because I felt that this is a very good question, a conceptual question, and that is why I thought that I would discuss this particular question in this particular discussion. Now we move on to the next question. So now we will discuss 2A. This is for 20 marks. It's for 20 marks. Word limit is not mentioned like it is mentioned in short notes that you can't write more than 150 words. But as you must be very well aware, all those students who have given the examination, UPSC only gives you a finite amount of space to write the answer. The answer booklet is printed and given to you. You have to write in the given space. You cannot demand extra sheets. You cannot get extra papers to write on. So that defined space is given. And the amount of space which is given to you as far as the 20 marker is concerned, you can write 250 to 300 words maximum. And once you write 300 words, the space which is allocated to you in the answer booklet, that is, you are able to fill that space and you have no more space to write down. So therefore, when you attempt a 20 marker, you should assume that you have to summarize, you have to complete your answer within 300 words maximum, 250 to 300 words when it comes to 20 markers. So 2A, this is explain the concept of balance of power. So very straightforward. The first part of the question is just explain what is balance of power and what are the various techniques of maintaining balance of power. So it's a conceptual question, a static question in nature. You have to basically define what is balance of power, what is the concept of balance of power, and then the second part of the question, you have to write down about the techniques which can be used to implement the concept of balance of power. So you start by introducing the concept. Balance of power is a realist concept. This is your first sentence of the answer. As I tell you always, you should hit the nail on the head. Write down what examiner is wanting to hear, wanting to read, that what you should spell out in your opening statement itself, that your conceptual clarity is there, you are crystal clear about these concepts, you know what has been asked. So your opening statement is balance of power is a realist concept. Balance of power refers to a condition in which no one state predominates the other, tending to create a rough equilibrium and limit hegemonic ambitions of all states. This is the basic definition of balance of power, that is, no one state should be allowed to dominate others. There should be a rough equilibrium of power when it comes to international politics. Again, mention scholars. You can write down the name of David Hume. David Hume says balance of power in IR is similar to common sense. As long as common sense is relevant, similarly, idea of balance of power is relevant in international politics. According to the realists, balance of power is a strategy for the protection of national interest, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and regional peace. This should be your next statement. that what is this balance of power, what will it help achieve? So according to the realist, this is what it will do. It will help you protect national interest, sovereignty, territorial integrity and regional peace. This is, according to the realist, balance of power is the solution to the problem of a security dilemma and uncertainty in international politics. Whereas according to the liberals, the solution to the problem of security dilemma and uncertainty is a collective security, whereas according to the realist, it is a balance of power. Then you should also highlight that this concept of balance of power, according to the classical realist, which is a school of classical realism, they say that it is a policy choice. According to classical realism, it is a policy choice. That means it will not happen automatically. Governments will have to make a policy choice of implementing the idea of balance of power. Whereas according to the neo-realist, given by scholars like Kenneth Waltz and John Mearsheimer, whereas classical realism has been majorly given by Hans J. Morgenthau, neo-realism has been propounded by Kenneth Waltz and scholars like Mearsheimer. Neo-realism says balance of power will arise automatically. It is not a policy choice, it will arise automatically in international politics. Then you also must write down what are the core assumptions of this concept. All the core assumptions, all the realist ideas are core assumptions. That is, it is based on the Westphalian world order. It believes that states are rational actors, that states will act to protect their national interest. It also says the structure of international politics is anarchic. It also says states live in a self-help world and therefore there would always be pursuit of power. And the concept of balance of power also says that power can only be balanced by a greater power. So, because all nations are power maximizers, so power can be balanced by greater power. And in this case, this helps you understand what is balance of power, that if there are countries which are maximizing their power, there should be such dynamics that increasing power of certain states should be balanced in a manner that there should be a rough equilibrium of power in world politics and no one country should be allowed to dominate the others. So this is the core assumption. And lastly, the idea of balance of power also says that there are no permanent friends and permanent enemies in IR. There is concept of shifting alliances, which we do see in IR. Then after highlighting these realist assumptions of the idea of BOP, then you can talk about types of balancing also. Briefly tell what are different types. There is internal balancing. By internal balancing is developing your domestic capabilities to balance the other. Then external balancing, which talks about alliances with other countries to balance the other. Then there is idea of soft balancing, which has been given by T.V. Paul and Robert Pape. T.V. Paul and Robert Pape. Soft balancing is an idea which has become very popular in the post-Cold War world. Soft balancing is non-military forms of balancing. Then there is the idea of non-military forms of balancing, which is done through the combination of diplomatic, economic and institutional methods. And then you have this new idea of asymmetrical balancing. Asymmetrical balancing again is a contemporary idea which says when countries of the world, they get together to counter the threat of terrorism, that is called asymmetrical balancing. So these are different types of balancing which should also be highlighted in the answer. And then finally, techniques, which has been explicitly asked in the question paper, that write down about the techniques which are available to do BOP, to do balance of power. So there are techniques, one by one you should write down. First is arms race. Arms race is one of them, and with each technique write one example. That will make your answer better. That will help your answer would look better if you give one example for each technique. So arms race, which was very much prevalent during the Cold War, we saw it. Then disarmament. Disarmament is another technique. For example, START treaties, which have been done between USSR and US in the previous century, and in right now also the START treaties are being renewed between to reduce weapons. It has been renewed between USA and Russia. Then partitioning a country, like Germany was partitioned after the end of the Second World War between as West Germany and East Germany. Then creation of buffer zones, for example the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, which has been created between North Korea and South Korea. Then forcing countries to pay reparations, again example is Treaty of Versailles. Germany was forced to pay reparations after the end of the World War. And then finally imposing demilitarization. Again, an apt example is Treaty of Versailles, where Germany was forced to demilitarize. Its military strength was capped by the victorious powers of the First World War. So these are different techniques to implement the idea of balance of power. So this is how you can attempt it. Straightforward question. First you define balance of power, then you write down about how it's a realist concept, it has realist assumptions, then write down about the types of balance of power, then finally the techniques which are available to implement the concept of balance of power. So this is how you can attempt this particular question. Now let us discuss the next question. So now I will discuss a 15 marker, which is 2B. Enumerate the challenges in the operation of the principles related to collective security in the UN Charter. So it's for 15 marks. So you can write down anywhere between 200 to 250 words, not more than that. So that is your natural word limit, even though it's not mentioned in the question paper. But like I've told you, you have a finite amount of space given in the answer booklet where you have to write your answers. So you can't write down more than 200 to 250 words. So in that word limit, you have to finish this. You have to attempt this question, and question is enumerate the challenges in the operation of the principles related to collective security in the UN Charter. So these are the two keywords here: collective security and UN Charter. So you have to, obviously highlight, talk about, write down about the concept of collective security, but then you should also be very well aware about the context of the question. Obviously, idea of collective security, it's a liberal concept. It's a very detailed concept, and you can write an essay on only collective security, idea of collective security. But we don't have to do that. We have to just restrict ourselves to the main definition of collective security and then write the remaining answer in the context of the question. What is the context of the question? In what context the question has been asked? And the question has been asked in this context that you have to just highlight the challenges which are there in UN, with respect to UN, in the pursuit of implementing collective security. United Nations is the body which has been given the responsibility which is the flag bearer of the concept of collective security in world politics. It has been given in its charter. It talks about UN Charter. UN Charter is the constitutional agreement on the basis of which UN has been created. In the UN Charter, this concept has been mentioned, and UN has been given the responsibility to implement the idea of collective security. But yes, like I have discussed in the previous question also, the performance of UN has not been very good. They have not been able to implement this concept in its true nature because of certain challenges, because of certain problems. And which are those problems? And those problems are there inside the charter. In the same charter, you see those problems. You see such provisions which are acting as a handicap, which are limiting the capability of UN to implement the concept of collective security. And this is exactly what you have to highlight in your answer. This is only what you can do in 250 words. Define collective security and then straight away jump to UN Charter and how UN has not been able to implement the concept in its true nature. There are very few instances where this has been implemented, and why they have not been able to, give reasons. So that is all what you can do here, and that is what we will do here in our discussion also. So the idea of collective security. So in the previous question, we discussed balance of power, which is a realist concept. That is a realist solution to the problem of security dilemma and uncertainty in international politics. And now this question is on collective security, which is what? Which is a liberal alternative to the realist idea of BOP. Collective security is a liberal alternative to the idea of to the realist idea of balance of power. It was first proposed by liberal institutionalist Woodrow Wilson when he had suggested the creation of League of Nations in his 14-point speech, which I have already discussed with you. So that was the first time when it was proposed. The first school of thought in IR was liberal institutionalism, was liberalism. When it was propounded, it was proposed by Woodrow Wilson in his 14-point speech after the end of the First World War. So this is, your opening statement is collective security is a liberal alternative to the realist idea of balance of power. First proposed by liberal institutionalism Woodrow Wilson in his recommendation of creating League of Nations. And what is this idea? That also you must start describing, start explaining what is the idea. Liberals believe that security of a nation is a common concern for all in order to preserve and ensure world peace. So security, the idea of security according to the liberals is a common concern of all to create a peaceful world. On the basis of this, this whole idea has been built. The collective security is the practice or pledge of nations to defend one another in order to deter aggression or to punish the aggressor if international order is breached. So this is the definition of collective security which must be written. Then next, you must also write, according to this concept of collective security, aggression can be best resisted by united action taken by number of states. That is how idea of collective security can act as an alternative to insecurity and uncertainty of power politics. And the basic principle of collective security is, which is often quoted and often told, the basic principle is all for one and one for all. That is the basic principle. Or you can say the slogan of the idea of collective security: all for one and one for all. And there must be an international body that has the moral authority and political capacity to take effective action and implement the idea of collective security. So there must be an international body. This is what you must mention. Initially, there was League of Nations during the interwar period, which failed. And now, after the Second World War, you have a similar body called United Nations Organization, which has been given the responsibility of implementing the idea of collective security. So you right away now jump to UN. What is there in UN Charter where it says that UN should implement concept of or principles of collective security? Article 1 of the Charter itself says, where the purposes of UN has been given. Article 1 itself says that UN should try and maintain international peace and security with the help of effective collective measures. So Article 1 of the Charter starts with the idea of collective security. Then Article 39 to 51. Article 39 to 51 of the Charter talks about how to implement collective security. It deals with collective security. In these articles, it is mentioned that United Nations Security Council has been empowered to decide on the issue of collective security. UNSC can take decisions has been given the responsibility to take decisions to implement collective security, by doing effective actions, by taking effective collective measures. Which are these measures? They are mentioned in chapter 6 and chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Chapter 6 is pacific settlement of disputes. Chapter 7 is enforcement measures, which also includes collective military action. So this is mentioned in chapter 6 and chapter 7. Chapter 6 and chapter 7 includes powers of UNSC, how UNSC can implement the idea of collective security. So despite all this being there, still when you look at the track record of UN, you see that there is a huge gap between the envisaged role and actual record of UN. There are only very few instances when UNSC has done collective military action in order to implement the idea of collective security. Which are these few instances? Korean crisis of the 1950s, and second is the Gulf War when Iraq had attacked Kuwait. So these are the only couple of instances which readily comes to our mind when we talk about collective military action by UNSC. Whereas there has been so many cases where the peace of the world has been breached, where the peace and prosperity of the world has been threatened, but still UNSC has not been able to take an effective action to implement collective security. Why? What are the reasons? Because in the same charter, it is written that 5 countries of UNSC will, 5 permanent members of United Nations Security Council will have the veto power. And in order to pass a resolution in UNSC, you need 9 votes out of 15. And also the second condition is that none of the veto powers should exercise their veto. So this veto power of these 5 permanent members have often been misused, and that has been one of the biggest reasons why UNSC has been ineffective in implementing the principles of collective security. Especially during this Cold War, veto power was misused more than 190 times. And therefore, the UNSC, the functioning of UNSC was paralyzed and it was made ineffective. This is the reason why UNSC has adapted itself and has come out with the idea of UN peacekeeping operations. Emergence of UN peacekeeping operations has been there because of the failure of the concept of collective security. These two are different. Collective security missions are military in nature, whereas UN peacekeeping operations only do a policing function. So this should be highlighted in your answer. Then if you have to criticize UN, and that's what we are expected to do in this particular answer, that why UN has not been able to implement principles of collective security, you must use the realist point of view. Realist will help you do that, because realists are the biggest critiques of liberal institutionalism and collective security. They say IR is about power struggle. Do balance of power instead of collective security. So realists, they say that there is a contradiction. Realists, they say that the liberals, they do not agree with the idea of power politics. Whereas the liberal institution UN itself is an embodiment of power politics. The 5 countries which have been given the permanent membership in UNSC and has also been given the veto power, they are dictating the whole organization. So you see recognition of power politics in UN itself, according to the realist. According to the realist, these permanent 5 members are in fact using UN as a tool to dominate other countries. So they say UN is also being used to exercise power politics because IR is nothing but a power struggle. So you must write down about the realist critique of UN. That will make your answer richer and also would look better, much better as an optional answer. Then also you should make that distinction that in the post-Cold War era, where misuse of veto power may have decreased, but still the UN is not able to uphold the concept of collective security the way it is expected to do because of Contemporary challenges. Now we have contemporary problems. Cold War may not be there, but there are new problems. Nature of conflicts have changed. Now we have less of interstate conflicts, but more of intrastate conflicts. And in case of intrastate conflicts, UN is unable to protect or uphold the idea of human security and justice, because Article 2 Clause 7 of UN Charter says UN cannot interfere in the internal matters of the member states. So UN is again unable to uphold ideas of human security and justice because of this. And then, in order to resolve this problem, UN has come out with the idea of R2P, responsibility to protect, where they can take actions in 4 cases, which are genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. But then R2P has also been criticized for its misuse by powerful countries to dominate the weaker countries. One example, one case in point is the Libyan crisis of the year 2011. When the ruler of the country was killed on the roads he was lynched by a mob, while NATO forces had been given the responsibility to prevent the genocide in Libya. So therefore, it is alleged that R2P is being misused by developed countries, richer countries, to dominate the weaker countries. So that is there. Then also another new challenge is terrorism. Terrorism is the new threat to peace in the world. And there's no mention in the UN Charter to deal with this new challenge. Therefore, UN has innovated by coming up with the 1267 Sanctions Committee, where, as per which Masood Azhar has also been banned. His activities has been banned, and his organization Jaish-e-Mohammed has been banned. A counter-terrorism committee, a 1267 Sanctions Committee, has also been created by UN to deal with that crisis. So these are the problems. UN Charter talks about collective security, talks about how it should be implemented, then at the same time there is a problem of misuse of veto power. At the same time, there's a problem where in the post-Cold War world, the intrastate conflicts are outside the purview of UN, and there are also new threats like terrorism, which is threatening peace of world, but UN has to find innovative methods to deal with this problem, because there's nothing inside the UN Charter helping us or guiding us how to deal with this newer problems. And yes, when it comes to veto power, even the Cold War has ended, but there are many crises, many conflicts going on in the world right now where UN is unable to act, because we have seen a new binary which has emerged inside United Nations Security Council, which is P2 versus P3. P2 versus P3. If it was USSR versus America in the previous century, now we have P2 versus P3, which is China and Russia coming together, and on this side you have US and its allies Britain and France. So that is the new binary which we have seen, because of which we don't see UN acting in the Syrian crisis. It is not able to do enough. UNSC is not able to take any effective measures when it comes to the Syrian crisis. So that is how you can attempt this particular question. Very straightforward. Start with concept of collective security and then straight away jump on to UN and its limitations. Okay. So now let us discuss question number 4C. So now we will have a discussion on this 15 marker 4C. The question says, examine the role of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the other major efforts by the UN to address the global environmental crisis. So again, very straightforward question, but very important from the context of recent developments, because this is the most burning issue, climate change, as far as international politics is concerned, and also the overall environmental degradation which is happening in on our planet. It is one of the most important issues in IR, and lot has happened over the years to help the world resolve these problems, adapt to climate change and also mitigate climate change, prevent environmental degradation. So this question talks about that you have to examine, that means analyze, describe both. You have to describe also and then analyze as well. Examine the role of UNFCCC and UN to address the global environmental crisis. So this question, you should first of all start by highlighting your opening statement should be about the issue of environment. That should be your opening statement of the answer. First 3 lines, you should highlight the issue of environment. So you should highlight how environment is a global issue. It does not respect national borders. The environmental problem is a transnational in character. Meaningful progress on environmental issues can only be made at the international level. Therefore, environmental problem or environmental degradation, environmental crisis cannot be solved by countries singularly. They must follow a multilateral method in order to resolve this problem or to overcome this crisis. It's a global problem, transnational in character. You have all kinds, a coordinated collective effort of nation states is required to deal with the problem of environmental degradation. And this is the reason why this international organization, UN, has since the year 1972, United Nations have made efforts to address this problem. United Nations have tried to act as that global forum where all member states, where nation states of the world have come together and have tried to collectively address this challenge, collectively resolve this crisis. So this starts from 1972. We should explain it chronologically, and in that chronology itself, UNFCCC would also come. Then you also explain UNFCCC and its contributions. And in the second part of the answer, we will do an analysis that what are the issues involved in the performance of UNFCCC climate change negotiations. What are the main issues involved? So that is how you attempt it. So 1972, as I told you, UN made an attempt to address the issue of environmental degradation. In 1972, UN Conference on Human Environment. UN Conference on Human Environment was held in Stockholm. In Stockholm, that is why it is also called the Stockholm Conference. As a result of this, an agency was created called United Nations Environment Program, which since then has been working under the supervision of UN. United Nations Environment Program has been helping member states coordinate efforts to resolve the crisis of environmental degradation. So 1972, UNEP was created. Then in the year 1987, under the supervision of the Secretary General of UN, in 1987, the Brundtland Commission was appointed. The Brundtland Commission was appointed, and this Brundtland Commission submitted its report to UN, which was named as Our Common Future. The name of the report was Our Common Future. And what is the biggest contribution of the Brundtland Commission? The report Our Common Future, it gave the concept of sustainable development. It did give the concept of sustainable development, which says that the resources, natural resources, should be used in a manner that we should be able to fulfill the needs of the present generation without sacrificing the needs of the future generation. So the concept of sustainable development has also come out of the has been a result of the efforts which have been made by UN. Then in the year 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, in 1992, the Rio Earth Summit was conducted. It was also called as United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. So technically it was named as the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. However, informally it was held at Rio, and it was called as Rio Earth Summit. It was done in 1992, and as a result of this summit, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created, 92. Then also a convention on biodiversity was also created. There were 3 outcomes of this particular summit. One is creation of UNFCCC, then is Convention on Biodiversity, and then also third, a Commission on Sustainable Development. So these were the 3 outcomes: creation of UNFCCC, creation of Convention on Biodiversity, and Commission on Sustainable Development. These were the 3 outcomes of the Rio Earth Summit. This, now we should elaborate for UNFCCC further, because that is also the requirement of the question. It has been specifically asked that what is the contribution of UNFCCC. When it comes to environmental issues, climate change is the most urgent and important challenge currently confronting international community. Climate change is caused because of global warming, which in turn is the result of greenhouse effect, which is caused by greenhouse gases, increasing amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this is one of the most urgent issues plaguing international politics right now. So UNFCCC was the first such attempt to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at the level that would prevent human-induced climate change. So it was the first such attempt, UNFCCC, where this goal was adopted that greenhouse gas concentrations should be limited, should be restricted to such a level in the atmosphere that we are able to prevent human-induced climate change. Also furthermore, UNFCCC is based on the principles of CBDR and historical responsibility. CBDR is common but differentiated responsibility. What is this idea of common but differentiated responsibility? Both these are interrelated. Climate change is, like I've told you, is caused by greenhouse gases, which are emitted. Greenhouse gas emissions happen by the burning of fossil fuels, which has been majorly done by the developed countries of the world, Western countries of the world. That is why the greenhouse gas concentrations in the environment has increased multifold, which has caused global warming. This is the reason why it is argued that the developed countries of the world are historically responsible for causing climate change. Therefore, they have more responsibility to deal with this problem. This is the reason why they should do more emission cuts, and they should devote more resources towards resolving this problem of climate change as compared to the developing world. This is the reason why, on the basis of the idea of historical responsibility, UNFCCC adopted this resolution called Common but Differentiated Responsibility. And An organization called IPCC has been given the responsibility to report on the implementation of UNFCCC goals. This is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which in fact was created before UNFCCC in IPCC, created in 1988, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has been given the responsibility to do reporting on UNFCCC goals. UNFCCC, which is formed on the basis of the principles of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, and historical responsibility. Now, since its creation in 1992, UNFCCC every year has been having COP summits, where all member states of UN are invited, and they try to reach an agreement. They do these climate change negotiations and try to develop a collective response in order to mitigate and adapt to climate change. As a result of these COP meetings, in 1997, Kyoto Protocol was adopted. In the year 1997, a Kyoto Protocol was adopted where binding targets were imposed only on developed countries of the world. Binding targets were imposed only on developed countries of the world. They were asked to reduce their carbon emissions by 5% below the 1990 levels by the year 2012. So, target year for Kyoto was 2012. That by 2012, developed countries of the world should reduce their carbon emissions by 5% less than of their 1990 emissions. Kyoto was supposed to end in 2012. So, after 2012, another follow-up treaty was required, a follow-up agreement was required to reduce carbon emissions in the atmosphere. For that, many COP meetings were held, for example, Copenhagen Summit in 2009, Durban Summit in 2012. However, unfortunately, countries of the world were not able to agree with each other on a common solution, a common agreement to follow up Kyoto. So, therefore, in 2012, Kyoto was extended to 2020, and finally, in 2015, the Paris Climate Agreement, or also known as the Paris Deal, was adopted, which will be implemented from 2020 onwards. According to the Paris Deal, all countries of the world, not just developed, but all countries of the world must submit INDCs to UNFCCC, which is intended nationally determined contributions, that voluntarily countries should commit to UNFCCC that how much carbon emission cuts they would do. And this has culminated in the form of Paris Deal, agreed in 2015, and has been implemented from 2020 onwards, because 2020 is when the period of Kyoto Protocol ends. So, this is what UNFCCC has done so far. If you talk strictly in terms of facts, this is what this has been its journey. This is what it has done in order to help resolve the problem of climate change. Now, when we do an examination and analysis of all of this, of all UN efforts to help resolve crisis of environmental degradation or even climate change as far as UNFCCC is concerned, we see one very important trend here. And what is that trend? That is the North-South divide. Environmental negotiations and climate change negotiations in international politics are plagued by the North-South divide. North-South divide, that is the disagreement between the developed world and the developing world on the issue of environmental degradation, on the issue of climate change, have many a times, paralyzed the environmental negotiations and climate change negotiations, and many a times this North-South divide has been responsible for not taking effective measures with respect to these problems. And for example, America, because of these disagreements with the developing world, America had not ratified the Kyoto Protocol. They did not ratify, they were not part of Kyoto. The largest emitters of carbon emission at that time in 97, they had not implemented Kyoto Protocol. They were the US Congress refused to ratify Kyoto Protocol. It happened in 97, got implemented in 2005, its period ended in 2012, which was further extended to 2020, but the US was not part of it. Then also this Paris deal, initially Barack Obama had signed the deal, but when Donald Trump got elected as the president of US in 2016, he did withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, which was a big setback to climate change negotiations as far as UNFCCC is concerned. So now let us discuss that why this happens, why these climate change negotiations, they've got into a problem many a times, and the biggest reason has been the North-South divide. And why this North-South divide is there? First of all, there has been a disagreement on the concept of historical responsibility and CBDR. There has been a disagreement. I have already explained to you in the video what is historical responsibility, and on the basis of that you can understand the common but differentiated responsibility principle, CBDR. Now there has been a disagreement between the developed world and the developing world on this. In 92, the developing countries were able to include these two in UNFCCC. But as the time has passed, the developed world, they do not agree with this anymore, and they do not want to take the blame of climate change and environmental degradation only on themselves. They also want the developing world to contribute resources and do carbon emission cuts. They consider this as unfair. So this has been one big bone of contention, because of which probably USA refused to ratify Kyoto Protocol, and also in the Paris Climate Agreement there has been hiccups as far as USA is concerned. Even though in the present context we have that good news of Joe Biden being elected as the president, and he has decided to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. The second reason for the North-South divide has been the great power rivalry between USA and China. Now, over the years, what has happened? China has become the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. Therefore, USA is very uncomfortable with this logic that we keep on recognizing China as a developing country, and therefore China is not expected to do more carbon emission cuts under the CBDR principle of UNFCCC, whereas USA is expected to do significant amount of carbon emission cuts and also devote significant amount of its economic resources to combat climate change. So the great power rivalry between US and China has also been a reason for the North-South divide, and this was the only reason why Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Thirdly, there is this dichotomy, there is this ethical question which is involved. Short-term economic self-interest is given priority over long-term environmental concerns. If we have to protect environment in the long term, then today in the present, short-term economic interests will have to be compromised. A lot of developed countries in the world are not willing to do that. Their people of the developed countries, of the North countries, they have a very high carbon footprint. Their luxurious lifestyles have been shaped in a manner that they use a lot of natural resources to support their lifestyles. So they have a very high carbon footprint, and they do not want to reduce that for the long-term interest of environmental protection. Then the fourth reason for the North-South divide, a more contemporary one, is that after the global financial crisis of 2009, the developed countries of the world do not want to devote their economic resources for climate change. They after the crisis, after the global financial crisis of 2009, more and more developed countries wants to do only very little for climate change, and therefore there is also this scarcity of funds which are needed to help the third world countries adapt to climate change, and also adopt green technologies, because these green technologies are very expensive. It needs funds, resources to help the third world adopt these green technologies and therefore do sustainable development. So there's a resource crunch, fund resource crunch also, which will be worsened in the days to come because of the COVID pandemic, because in the post-COVID world, we are going to see more and more economies in the world going through a slowdown. So when economies of the world are going through a slowdown, they are not going to be very happy devoting their scarce economic resources towards climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts. So these are the reasons, broadly 4 reasons, which I have explained to you, which are responsible for this north-south divide. And because of this, we see hiccups, we see problems in climate change negotiations. Constantly we have seen America not being part of these negotiations and not signing the global agreements, or not being part of the global agreements to mitigate climate change. So this is the biggest issue which is involved in climate change negotiations and environmental negotiations. That is the north-south divide, which should be highlighted in the answer. Okay, so this is how you can attempt this particular question. Now we shall have a discussion on, we will discuss question number 3, part C. So question number 3, part C. So this is also again a very important question mentioned in the syllabus NEO, but very rarely asked. But this year UPSC has decided to ask, and therefore this is a very good opportunity to discuss this concept with all of you, so that you are prepared to answer any questions on NEO in future course of time also, and also the ones who are going to appear this year, they should also understand that all topics in the syllabus are important. Many times students used to ignore this topic. They said that it's outdated, it is not asked anymore. But no, all topics in the syllabus are important, and UPSC has all the right in the world to ask question on any of the topics in the syllabus any time. So this is, in that particular context, we must understand that after a lot of years, this particular question, a question on new international economic order, which is mentioned in the syllabus NEO, has been asked. So let us discuss this question. Explain the significance and importance of the demand raised by the developing countries for a new international economic order. Are they likely to achieve their objectives of NEO in foreseeable future? So basically this is a question from the chapter of NEO. Very straightforward question. If you have done the chapter, you have to basically do nothing but explain what is NEO, what are its demands, what was the focus and the significance of NEO. That you have to explain in the first part of the answer, and in the second part of the answer you have to highlight its contemporary relevance. That is something which should be, whether it is said or whether it is written or whether it is not there in the question, you should always do it in UPSC. Even in GS, if you are writing a question on any issue, you should always end the question by highlighting the contemporary relevance of the issue. And in this case, in the question itself, they have told you that you should also analyze that whether, are these developing countries likely to achieve their objectives of NEO in a foreseeable future. So this is the question, and that is how it should be. That is how it should be, attempted. And let us start the discussion now. New international economic order. What is NEO? Significance of NEO, demands of NEO. That is the first part of the question. So, New International Economic Order is an umbrella term for Global South's demands and programs to introduce new economic order at the global level. It was kind of a manifesto for change in international system to make it more just towards the concerns of developing countries. So basically, NEO was a demand from the developing countries from the global south, and they demanded that the international economic order should undergo a change. And what change? A change should be made in a manner that the new international economic order becomes just, fair for the developing countries also. The idea of NEO arose in the 1960s. In 1960s, when decolonization was happening, more and more new countries, new nation states were emerging on the global scene. And all these, they form a common block of countries, the developing countries or the global south. And even they were also all together in the NAM grouping, non-aligned countries, non-aligned movement. So all these countries got together in the 60s. The 60s they decided demanding that the international economic order, that the international economy should undergo a fundamental structural change, so that the international economy becomes more equitable, it should become more just, it should become more fair for the developing countries also. So that was the significant demand which was made. In 1960s, this demand arose, and this demand took its concrete shape in the year 1974. On 1st of May 1974, all these developing countries, global south countries, were able to pass a resolution on NEO in the United Nations General Assembly. So on 1st of May 1974, officially 2 resolutions on establishment of the new international economic order was passed by the United Nations General Assembly. In these resolutions, both these resolutions, core features of the new international economic order, main demands of the developing countries were listed. Now, which were these demands? First demand was sovereign equality of states and right to adopt their own economic and social system. Sovereign equality of states and right to adopt their own economic and social system. Second demand was full sovereignty of states over its natural resources and the regulation of transnational corporations. So it talked about raw material sovereignty, that there should be full sovereignty of the developing countries over the natural resources, and they should also be given the right to regulate transnational corporations. Then the third demand was just relationship between prices of raw materials from developing countries and developed countries. Also, these resolutions, they demanded that international assistance should be given to promote industrialization in the developing countries. In order to promote industrialization in the developing countries, international assistance, aid, grant should be given. Technology transfer incentives should be given for industrialization in developing countries. So it also talked about technology transfer and international assistance. It also demanded that there should be an overhaul, a complete change in the rules of international trade. International trade should be made more equitable, more inclusive. It also demanded that there should be a reform of international monetary system. That means reform in the Bretton Woods organizations. And then it also says that there should be strengthening of UN bodies. the role of UN bodies should be strengthened in order to implement the new international economic order. And finally, NEO set of demands says that the cooperation must be promoted among South countries. That South-South cooperation, South countries should cooperate with each other. They should have solidarity, unity in order to fulfill all these demands of NEO. So this is what NEO is. This is how you start. It's part of history of international relations. The demand by the developing countries was first arose in 1960s. It took a concrete shape in 1974 when UN General Assembly passed 2 resolutions on NEO, which had a list of all the demands of NEO, which I have just mentioned to you, and all these must be mentioned in the answer as well. Now the question also says significance of these demands. What was the significance of these demands? What was the importance of these demands? In here you should bring out why NEO. Here you should bring out, in this part of the question, you should bring out why NEO. What was the need? Why was it so desperately needed? What was the importance of these demands? This should be highlighted in this part of the question. And it is, here you should articulate in your answer that NEO was needed to end the development gap, because there was a significant development gap in between the developed and the developing countries. And this development gap was the result of geography and history, because historically these developing countries have been exploited because of colonialism and imperialism. Southern countries, southern hemisphere countries, they have been exploited by the northern hemisphere countries or the western countries predominantly because of colonialism and imperialism. They have been subjugated to economic exploitation. So geography and history has shaped the present destiny of underdevelopment of South countries. So there was a significant development gap which was unfair, which was also criticized heavily by the Marxist scholars, dependency school scholars, Immanuel Wallerstein, Andre Gundo Frank, Raoul Prebisch. All these people played a very important role in articulating the demands of NEO, and you should mention all these scholars in your answer. And you should also, in order to highlight the importance of the demands, you must talk about the Willy Brandt line. In order to highlight the importance of the demands, in order to highlight and bring out the development gap between North and South countries, highlight the North-South divide in terms of development, you must talk about the Willy Brandt line, which was conceptualized in the year 1980. In 1980, this analysis was done, and certain facts and figures were proposed, which was popularly known as the Willy Brandt line. Under this Willy Brandt line, this idea of Willy Brandt line, it was articulated that North countries have 25% of the population, whereas South countries have 75% of the population. However, when it comes to income, North countries have 80% of the world income, whereas the South countries have 20% of the world income. And similarly, when it comes to manufacturing, 90% of the world manufacturing is done by North countries, and only 10% of the world manufacturing is done by the South countries. When it comes to research and development, R&D, 96% of the world R&D is done by North countries, and only 4% of R&D is done by the South countries. So this analysis, which came out in the public domain in the year 1980, was done by Mr. Willy Brandt, and it is often therefore called as the Willy Brandt line. This is the Willy Brandt line. 25% of world population North countries, whereas 75% in South countries. However, income in North countries have 80% of world income. They have 90% of the world manufacturing. They have 96% of the world research and development. So this is the development dichotomy. This is the development dichotomy, perfectly explained with the help of the Willy Brandt line. And in order to correct this development dichotomy, in order to correct the wrongs of the colonial past, this demands of NEO was proposed. This is why, NEO was proposed in order to correct the wrongs of the colonial past and in order to correct this development gap. Okay, so this is your first part of the question, that is, examine or highlight the importance and significance of the demands of NEO given by the developing countries. That is your first part of the question. Then, and also while explaining this, you must highlight dependency school theorist Andre Gunder Frank, Wallerstein, Rolf Prebisch. All these names which are given to you in the notes must be mentioned in the answer. Then the second part of the question is, are they likely to achieve their objectives of NEO in foreseeable future? So are they likely to achieve the objectives of NEO in the foreseeable future? So what is means contemporary relevance of this idea. So when you look at before you start attempting this, you must write down briefly about what has been the fate of NEO, what happened to NEO. So this, idea of demand of NEO was proposed. However, what happened in the 1980s? 1980s, Western countries of the world, they proposed neoliberal economic policies in the form of Washington Consensus. Neoliberal economic policies in the form of Washington Consensus was promoted by G7 countries of the world. Neoliberal economic policies, rolling back the state. So market should take control. So these neoliberal economic policies was promoted by G7 countries in the form of Washington Consensus in the 80s. And this was done, these neoliberal economic policies were promoted with the help of structural adjustment programs forced on developing countries by bodies like IMF and the World Bank. And these neoliberal economic policies were heavily supported by leaders of those times like Margaret Thatcher or also the American President Ronald Reagan. And in fact, Margaret Thatcher had given the idea called TINA factor. She had argued, she had proposed that in order to have prosperity and development, there is no other alternative. TINA factor, there is only one path forward, and that is to adopt neoliberal economic policies. So the TINA factor at that time was also popularized. So this happened in 80s. 60s, NEO demand started. 70s, UN passed resolutions. Development gap also highlighted by Willy Brandt in 1980. But in the 80s, the developed countries, they got together, G7 countries, the most industrialized countries of the world, they got together and they decided to promote this. And they succeeded in doing this. They were successful in doing this, and they were successful in implementing the idea of liberalization, privatization, and globalization all around the world. And in fact, WTO was also created on the basis of these ideas in the year 1995. And therefore, the idea of NEO has taken a backseat. That is why the idea of NEO and the demands of NEO has taken a backseat. But now, when you talk in contemporary terms, especially the global economic recession of 2009, global economic recession of 2009 has punctured the balloon of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism today is under crisis, and it has punctured the balloon of neoliberalism. It has proven to the world how these policies are not right policies. They do not benefit the developing world. Forget about developing world, they do not even benefit the developed world. That is why today we see more conservationist attitude when it also comes to the Western countries like UK and US. So therefore, again there has been push for demands of NEO, that we should have a more equitable kind of a world economy, inclusive world economy, where all should benefit. There should be such changes in international economic order that all developing, underdeveloped, emerging economies, great powers, everybody should benefit. And in fact, this is also visible in the formation of BRICS. BRICS is often described as a rise of the South, and one can have some hope that BRICS can one day help achieve demands of NEO. In fact, they have started challenging the Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus was represented by World Bank and IMF, and BRICS have challenged that hegemony of these institutions by creating an institution of its own called the New Development Bank. And BRICS also represents a South-South cooperation, which was one of the demands of NEO. And also there is more and more pressure in world politics today to reform multilateral organizations, reform of UN, reform of IMF, reform of World Bank. Also reforms in WTO are being argued more and more passionately these days. So therefore, especially after the economic recession of 2009, the balloon of neoliberal policies have been punctured, and there has been a trend in the opposite direction where we see emergence of the South in the form of bodies like BRICS. So still there's a long way to go, but yes, again demands of NEO, which were propounded way back in the 1960s, have in this particular context become important again. So this is how you should attempt this particular question. Now we will move on to section B of this paper, which is on India and the world, where majority of the questions are on Indian foreign policy, how Indian foreign policy is made, which institutions are involved, and India's bilateral relations with other countries of the world. So we will, in the next section of the video, we will discuss few questions from section B, which is on the area called India and the world.